June 6th, 1944. The hour is not yet dawn. Somewhere over the black water of the English Channel, the wind carries the smell of diesel and salt water and something else, something older. Something almost biological, the smell of tens of thousands of men pressed together in flat-bottomed boats. Breathing in the dark, waiting. The engines drone. The boats rise and fall. Some men pray. Some are sick. Some stare at nothing, their rifles held across their chests, the way a man holds something he does not wish to drop, and in the hands of nearly every American infantryman aboard those vessels tucked between trembling fingers in a cold steel hull rests a rifle. 9.5 pounds of walnut and steel. 43.5 inches from muzzle to, but gas-operated, semi-automatic. 8 rounds loaded in a clip that will eject with a metallic ping when the last cartridge has been fired. Its designation is United States Rifle, caliber .30 M1. Its name, spoken by the men who carry it, is simpler. They call it the Garand. In the bunkers above those beaches, behind concrete walls thick enough to stop artillery, behind MG-42 machine guns set to sweep the sand at ankle height, German soldiers wait too. Many of them are veterans. Some have survived the Eastern Front. Some have walked through burning cities and frozen forests and have learned to measure their enemies quickly. By their equipment and their bearing and the sound of their weapons, they have studied the Americans. They have read intelligence reports, and somewhere in the accumulated doctrine of the Wehrmacht, there is a settled verdict on the American service rifle. It is a weapon built on the wrong idea. The American soldier fires too quickly, too eagerly, too wastefully. He burns through ammunition like a man who has never had to carry it. The semi-automatic Garand, in this view, is not an advantage. It is a symptom. It reveals a nation that has never understood the economy of war. That verdict was about to be revised. To understand what happened on those beaches, and in the hedgerows beyond them, and in the shattered villages of Normandy in the weeks that followed, it is necessary to go back further, back to a drafting table in a government laboratory, back to a decade of argument and testing and political resistance, back to the moment when a Canadian-born engineer named John Garand sat down and tried to solve a problem that armies had been living with since the first bolt-action rifle was fielded in the 19th century. The problem was this. A soldier in combat fires in two states. He fires deliberately when he has time and a clear target in a steady position, and he fires desperately when the enemy is close and the situation is collapsing, and the difference between surviving and not surviving is measured in fractions of a second. The bolt-action rifle, the Mauser, the Springfield, the Lee-Enfield, was well suited to the first state. It was not suited to the second. After each shot, the soldier had to lift his hand, cycle the bolt, chamber a new round, and return his hand to the firing position. The movement is small. It takes perhaps a second, perhaps less for a trained man. But in that second, the soldier's eye leaves the target. His shoulder comes off the stock, his cheek comes off the comb, and the world reassembles itself slightly differently than it was before. In a trench at 500 yards, this costs nothing. In a farmyard at 30 feet, it can cost everything. Garand began his work at Springfield Armory in 1919. He was not the only man. Working on the problem, armies around the world understood that the bolt-action's days were numbered, but he pursued it with a particular patience and a particular clarity of mechanical thinking. His early designs were set aside, revised, rejected, resubmitted. The Army tested the weapon in 1932, rejected it on technical grounds, asked for modifications, tested again. They tested it in rain and mud and sand. They tested it in extreme cold. They tested it when it was clean and when it had not been cleaned in 2 weeks. By 1936, after nearly 2 decades of refinement, the United States Army officially adopted the Garand as its standard service rifle. General Georges Patton, who had a talent for cutting through sentiment to substance, would later call it the greatest battle implement ever devised. The rest of the world was not impressed. German military analysts looked at the Garand and came to a predictable conclusion. Rooted in a doctrine that had served them well through Poland and France and the early campaigns in North Africa, the Wehrmacht's standard infantry rifle, the Karabiner 98K, was a bolt-action weapon. It was accurate, reliable, built on the premise that the infantryman's role was to fire carefully, to conserve ammunition, and to support the work of crew-served weapons, the machine gun above all. In German tactical doctrine, the MG-42 was the center of the squad's firepower. The rifleman existed to protect it and to exploit its effects. Semi-automatic rifles, in this view, did not change this calculation. They simply encouraged soldiers to waste rounds. The problem with Americans, certain German officers believed, was that they had no instinct for fire discipline. The Garand confirmed this prejudice. It was, in their assessment, a rifle designed for a people who thought that more was always better, more firepower, more ammunition, more of everything, without understanding that war was ultimately a contest of will and precision, not abundance. This was a reasonable position to hold. As long as you were fighting the Americans, you expected to find it. It began to fail on the morning of June 6, 1944, when the Americans, those German defenders actually found, were nothing like what the doctrine had. Described, the ramp of a Higgins boat drops into the shallow water off Omaha Beach at approximately 6:30 in the morning, and the men who charge through that gap run into a wall of fire. Many are hit in the water. Many are hit on the sand. Those who survive the first moments find what cover they can, a steel obstacle, a body, the slight depression of a wave mark in the sand, and they begin to fight back. And here is where something unexpected begins to happen. Not a reversal of fortune, not a miracle. Something more mechanical than that, and in its own way more profound. A German soldier manning a position at WN62, one of the strong points overlooking the beach, would have trained to expect a rhythm in the American fire. The American shoots. There is a pause, brief but real, while he cycles his bolt. The German, in that pause, moves, shifts, fires. It is a rhythm as old as infantry combat, a command response built into the physics of the weapons on either side. But on June 6th, that pause does not come. The American shoots, and then he shoots again and again. And again, 8 rounds as fast as he can, pull a trigger, and then there is a pause. Sharp and metallic, the sound of an empty clip ejecting ping, and then he shoots again. The rhythm is wrong. The cadence is wrong. The German soldier, calibrated to exploit a pause that does not exist, must recalibrate on the fly, in combat, under stress, against an enemy who is already adapting faster than the doctrine said he should. Military. Historians have noted the peculiar psychological effect of the Garand's rate of fire on its opponents. It was not simply a matter of more bullets. It was a matter of disrupted expectation. The German soldier in his bunker had been trained in a world where infantry fire had a tempo, where the shooter was briefly vulnerable between rounds, where a patient man could read the battlefield like music and move in the rests. The Garand eliminated those rests. It produced a nearly continuous threat that forced the defender to stay down, to keep his head below the parapet, to give up the initiative at the moment when initiative was everything. Soldiers in well-prepared defensive positions can absorb enormous quantities of fire if they are able to choose when to expose themselves. The Garand made that choice dangerous in a way it had not been before. At Utah Beach, where the landings went more smoothly and the American advance pushed quickly inland, soldiers of the 4th Infantry Division moved through the flooded fields behind the dunes and engaged German defenders in a series of close engagements that would become the template for the fighting to come. Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers, in an action on June 6 that would earn him the Distinguished Service Cross, attacked a series of farm buildings at Mezières single-handedly. Clearing 11 buildings and killing an estimated 50 German soldiers, he was armed with a Thompson submachine gun, not a Garand. But his action illustrates the broader tactical truth that the Garand made possible across the entire invasion. An individual American soldier, properly equipped and trained, could generate enough firepower to suppress multiple defenders and advance. Against prepared positions in ways that no bolt-action rifleman could have managed, the individual had become a force multiplier in the hedgerow country, beyond the beaches. Garand's advantages became even more pronounced. Normandy's bocage, the dense network of earthen banks and thick hedges that divided the countryside into a maze of small fields, was an environment that had stripped away almost every advantage that air power, artillery, and armor provided. Tanks could not see beyond the next hedgerow. Aircraft could not find targets in the green tangle below. Artillery was as likely to hit friendly troops as enemy ones. The bocage returned the war to its oldest and most primal form. Men with rifles, a few yards apart, killing each other in the dark, in this environment. Rate of fire was not an advantage. It was the advantage. A squad of American infantry working through the bocage would advance to a gap in a hedgerow, take fire from the far side, and immediately return fire with a volume that a squad of bolt-action riflemen simply could not match. The suppression bought time. The time allowed maneuver. The maneuver flanking moving around the hedge rather than through it was the tactic, but it required the suppression to work, and the suppression required the Garand. A company of Wehrmacht soldiers on the far side of a hedgerow, being swept by the fire of a dozen Garands, experienced something that their training had not fully prepared them for. The sensation of being outgunned by individual infantrymen. Not by a machine gun, not by artillery, but by ordinary soldiers with ordinary rifles who somehow never seemed to pause. The German army was not populated by fools, and their response to the Garand was not denial. It was documentation, and eventually a kind of reluctant professional admiration. After-action reports from Normandy, recovered in the decades following the war, show a pattern of German commanders noting the unusual volume of small arms fire from American positions, fire that was difficult to suppress precisely because it did not come from a cruiser weapon that could be identified and targeted, but from dispersed individual soldiers who were individually and collectively capable of maintaining a rate of fire that felt continuous. One German report from the fighting in the Cotentin Peninsula noted that the fire from American infantry was extraordinarily dense and that attempts to advance against American positions, even under covering fire, resulted in casualties that were disproportionate to the tactical situation. This was the language of officers trying to understand something that their doctrine had told them should not be possible. There is a number that appears repeatedly in any honest accounting of the Garand's effect on the Normandy campaign, and that number is 45. That is, very roughly, the number of aimed rounds per minute that a trained soldier could fire from the M1 Garand under field conditions. The Carabiner 98K, in the hands of a well-trained soldier, could manage perhaps 15 rounds per minute of aimed fire, and fewer in sustained firing when the barrel heated and the soldier fatigued. The gap 30 rounds per minute between an American infantryman and his German counterpart was not merely a statistical advantage. It translated directly into the physics of suppression, the geometry of maneuver, and the mathematics of casualty exchange that determined who held ground at the end of each engagement. Against this must be set the German advantages, which were real and should not be minimized. The Wehrmacht in Normandy fought from prepared positions, with interior lines of communication, with a knowledge of the terrain, and with weapons, particularly the MG42 machine gun and the Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket, that were in some respects superior to their American equivalents. The MG42 fired at a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute and produced a sound so distinctive, a tearing, mechanical screech rather than the familiar stutter of other machine guns, that it became one of the defining auditory experiences of the campaign. American soldiers called it Hitler's buzzsaw. It was a devastating weapon. It killed many men who carried Garands. The point is not that the Garand made Americans invincible. The point is that it changed the terms of the exchange in ways that accumulated over time. Engagement by engagement, hedgerow by hedgerow, village by village, until they had altered the strategic outcome. The logistical dimension of the Garand story is less dramatic than the tactical one, but it is equally important, and it tells a different kind of story, not about the weapon itself, but about the nation that built it. By June 1944, American industry had produced approximately 4 million M1 Garand rifles. Springfield Armory and Winchester Repeating Arms Company were the primary manufacturers, and their combined output had equipped not just the Army and Marine Corps, but had sent weapons to its allied forces across multiple theaters of war. The production run required the machining of hundreds of individual components to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, organized into an assembly process that could be learned by workers with no prior gunsmithing experience. Repeated at scale, across multiple shifts, 7 days a week, for years. This was not craftsmanship in any traditional sense. It was something newer and, in the context of a global industrial war, something more powerful. It was the application of mass production to precision engineering. The same logic that built automobiles and refrigerators and washing machines now applied to the problem of equipping an army. German engineers, for their part, looked at the Garand's design and found much to admire. After the first encounters in Normandy, Wehrmacht ordnance officers began requesting examples of captured Garands for testing and analysis. Their reports acknowledged the weapon's reliability and its mechanical elegance. Garand's gas-supported system, which used a small amount of propellant gas tapped from the barrel to cycle the action, was both more reliable than competing semi-automatic designs and simpler to manufacture than many alternatives. What the Germans could not replicate was not the engineering. It was the industrial capacity. Germany had its own semi-automatic rifle, the Guhar 43, which entered service in 1943 and was in some respects a direct response to the lessons of the Eastern Front, where Soviet semi-automatic rifles had demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical advantage that the Garand was now demonstrating in France. But the Guhar 43 was never produced in sufficient numbers. By July 1944, as the Allied breakout from Normandy began, Germany was producing Guhar 43 rifles at a rate of perhaps 10,000 per month. American factories were producing Garands at a rate that dwarfed this figure. The arithmetic of industrial capacity, playing out over months and years, had already decided what the rifle battles in the Bocage were only beginning to demonstrate. There is a moment in mid-July 1944 that serves, in some ways, as a kind of parable for all of this. It occurred during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the Norman bridgehead, in a field near St. Lay. A platoon of the 30th Infantry Division had crossed a hedgerow under fire and taken a position in an orchard. They were engaged by a German patrol that had mistaken their position in the confusion of the Bocage fighting. The exchange lasted perhaps 3 minutes. When it ended, the patrol had been driven back with casualties, and the American soldiers who had done the fighting were already reloading, their Garands emptied and refilled. Before the smoke had fully cleared, a soldier who was there later described it in a letter. Not with any particular drama, but with the flat, practical language of a man reporting what he had seen. We put out a lot of fire real fast, and they went away. This is not the language of heroism. It is the language of competence. It is what happens when a weapon and a doctrine and an industrial system have been aligned over years of preparation to produce a particular kind of soldier, one who is, in the specific language of infantry combat, effective. The word effective carries a weight that is easy to overlook. To be effective in the Bocage in 1944 was to stay alive. To be effective at the squad level was to protect the men on your left and right. To be effective at the division level was to take ground and hold it and advance again tomorrow. And somewhere beneath all of this, somewhere in the mechanical fact of a gas-operated action cycling 45 times a minute, was a claim about what kind of country America was, a claim not made in speeches or proclamations, but made in steel and walnut and precision manufacturing, made in the patience of an engineer at a drafting table in 1919, made in the discipline of a production line running 3 shifts a day, made in the calluses of a soldier in a landing craft who knows that when the ramp drops, the thing in his hands will work. The German army, by the summer of 1944, had begun to understand that they were not fighting the Americans they had expected. The intelligence assessments had described a wealthy but soft opponent, a people made comfortable by abundance, unaccustomed to sacrifice, unlikely to sustain losses without breaking. This assessment was not entirely wrong about the nature of American society. but it misread what American society could produce when it directed its abundance toward a specific purpose. The Garand was not an accident of prosperity. It was a deliberate expression of it, a decision to give every individual soldier, not just specialized units, not just officers or veterans, but every private who stepped off a landing craft, the means to fight effectively as an individual. In the Wehrmacht's infantry doctrine, the individual soldier was a component of a system. His value was his position in the squad, his relationship to the machine gun, his discipline in conserving fire and waiting for the right moment. This doctrine had produced extraordinarily effective soldiers and extraordinarily effective armies. But it had been built on the assumption that the adversary's infantry would fight by similar rules, that the tempo of bolt-action fire would impose a mutual cadence on the battle, that the MG42 would dominate the exchange, and that the German soldiers' superior training and preparation would decide the outcome at the margins. The Garand changed those assumptions. It offered American infantry something that German doctrine had never fully valorized: individual autonomy of fire. The American soldier did not need to wait for the machine gun. He did not need to wait for anyone. He could, on his own, suppress a position, create a moment of opportunity, and force the enemy to respond. Multiplied across a squad, a platoon, a regiment, this individual autonomy became a collective force that was qualitatively different from anything the Wehrmacht had encountered at. Scaled by August 1944, the German forces in Normandy were in full retreat. The Falaise Pocket, the encirclement that destroyed the bulk of two German armies, was the operational outcome of the breakout. But the operational outcome had been built, engagement by engagement, on the tactical reality that American infantry could generate and sustain a rate of fire that German infantry, even in prepared positions, could not match indefinitely. The hedgerows that had seemed so perfectly suited to defense had become, in the face of the Garand's volume, less of an advantage than their defenders had hoped. The suppression that preceded each American assault had not been delivered by artillery alone, or by aircraft alone, but by the accumulated fire of thousands of individual soldiers with semi-automatic rifles, each one laying down a weight of fire that a bolt-action rifleman could not approach. After the war, a number of German officers wrote assessments of the American Army for the Historical Division of the U.S. Army, which had commissioned a series of studies to understand the experience from the other side. These documents are remarkable for their candor. Several of them return, in different ways, to the same observation: the American infantryman, individually, was better armed than his German counterpart, not better trained. Necessarily, the German army's training system remained formidable throughout the war, and not always better led, and not always better motivated, but better armed. The rifle they carried gave them a capability that the German doctrine had not anticipated, and that the German ordnance system could not match quickly enough to matter. General der Infanterie Gunther Blum, writing in one such assessment, noted that the American infantry's rate of small arms fire was a constant source of tactical difficulty for German units, and that the disparity in individual firepower had compelled German commanders to rely more heavily on fortified positions than their doctrine preferred, since open maneuver under the fire of American rifles invited casualties that the Wehrmacht could not sustain. This is the bureaucratic language of professional military analysis. But behind it lies a real experience. The experience of soldiers in the Bukaz who had expected pauses that did not come, who had trained for a rhythm that the Garand refused to keep, who had calculated the calculus of exposure and found that it no longer worked. The Garand went on to fight in Italy. In the Pacific, in Korea, it remained the standard American service rifle until 1957, when it was replaced by the M14 itself, a derivative design. Soldiers who carried it in later wars remembered it with a particular affection that is different from nostalgia, not the sentiment of men remembering their youth, but the respect of craftsmen for a tool that always worked. Eugene Stoner, who designed the AR-15 and its military variant, the M16, began his education in small arms engineering, partly by studying the Garand's gas system. The rifle's influence on American small arms development extended across decades. shaping the assumptions and the engineering vocabulary of every service rifle that followed it. John Garand himself, who had spent nearly 2 decades developing his rifle without ever receiving a patent royalty. He had signed those rights over to the government when he took the job at Springfield Armory, was awarded a payment of $100,000 by Congress in 1953. In recognition of his contribution, it was, by any measure, a modest reward for a weapon that had been carried by millions of men across every theater of the largest war in human history. Garand accepted it without complaint. He had understood from the beginning that the rifle was not his. It belonged to the men who carried it. On the beaches of Normandy, those men are now old or gone. The sand has long since been smoothed by tides that know nothing of what happened there. The bunkers still stand in some places. Concrete is patient, and the fields beyond the beaches are green in summer and quiet. The hedgerows trimmed back, the farmers' lanes running between them as they have for centuries. Tourists walk the beaches and read the plaques and try to imagine what it was like. They cannot quite. The imagination fails at the scale of it, at the noise and the cold water and the men falling in the surf. But they can hold, if they visit the museum, the weight of a Garand in their hands. They can feel the solidity of it. The density that comes from every component being exactly the right size and material and finish. They can work the action and hear the click of the mechanism cycling and understand, in their hands, if not their minds, something about the particular kind of faith that a soldier places in the object. He carries the faith that it will work when nothing else does, that it will keep the rhythm when every other rhythm has broken down, that it will speak when words have run out and the ramp is dropping. The water is cold and the sand is far away. The clip ejects with a ping. 8 rounds spent. The action locks open, waiting. In that brief moment of silence, before the next clip is seated and the bolt released, there is something that sounds almost like music, the sound of a machine that has done exactly what it was made to do, in exactly the way it was made to do it, in the hands of a man who needed it to work. That ping echoed across Normandy in the summer of 1944. It echoed down the hedgerows and across the ruined villages and over the fields where the wheat had grown before the armies came. The Germans heard it. They had been told it was the sound of waste, the signature of a people who spent ammunition the way they spent money. Carelessly, without understanding the value of things, they discovered in the weeks that followed that they had misread the sound entirely. It was not the sound of waste. It was the sound of readiness. It was the sound of a country that had decided, with its characteristic and sometimes maddening confidence, that every man in its army deserved the best weapon that its industry could produce, and had then produced it, in the millions, and put it in every pair of hands that stepped onto those beaches. Freedom, it turns out, is not only an idea. Sometimes it is a gas-operated semi-automatic rifle. 9.5 pounds, 45 aimed rounds per minute, built by workers in Massachusetts and Connecticut who never saw the beaches where their work was tested, and carried by men who understood at the deepest level of muscle and reflex and animal survival what it meant to hold something in their hands that would not fail them. The tide came in. The tide went out. The rifles kept firing.